Not all of them. Some of them are in Article 6, 8 meetings. And I also have to excuse myself because about 10 minutes before I'm going to have to go and chair a contact group, so I apologize for that. But it's a pleasure. My name is Andre Marcu. I'm the executive director of the something with a very long name, the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. This is a side event that is organized in collaboration with our Brussels friends from Business Europe and also with advocates for international development, with our lawyers eradicating poverty. We have a very interesting panel that should include by Diagne, who is the head negotiator for markets for the African Group of Negotiators. We should also have Martin Hession, who is the lead negotiator for Article 6 for the European Union. If they all both materialize, then instead of Molly, P-Stanley, who's the American negotiator, who unfortunately, as always in these cases, you never know what's going to happen. Molly can't make it. But graciously, Andrea Bonzani, who is the International Policy Director of AIDA, the International Emission Trading Association, has gracefully agreed to step in and help us, and we promise to do the same thing when they need something. But then our partners, Tanya Kumar, and she's with the Confederation of British Industry, and of course part of Business Europe. Yasmin Batliwala, who's the chief executive of the A4ID, and then Roger Lees, who is the chair of A4ID and partner at Clifford Chance LLP. So what are we talking about here? The topic of the day, if you want. I mean, there is a whole bunch of people, everybody peddling a different subject in a different side event. It's a little bit like a bazaar. It's understanding the current state of play and a voluntary carbon market. So the intention is to talk about the state of discussion that is happening here in the UNFCCC, because as you probably know, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement has been, it's in the Paris Agreement, talks about international cooperation, and in Article 6.2 and 6.4 cover markets, the market aspects and the rules for transfers and the rule for creating carbon credits under the UNFCCC. So those are, that is being negotiated here, but there are a side to it which includes impact of carbon or voluntary markets. Voluntary markets under the Kyoto Protocol and the regulatory market have been quite different animals. Things are a lot more fluid now under the Paris Agreement, and there are provisions in the Paris Agreement, Article 6 rulebook, that have impact on the voluntary market. So the intent was very much to give you an update and then go into how the current state of play, the current discussion, if you want, interacts with the voluntary market and the evolution of the voluntary markets. Now, I think that it looks like my friends Mbaye and Martin will make an appearance. Martin always makes a late appearance. Mbaye is sometimes more punctual, but it is nevertheless always uncertain. So what I will ask is Andrea to start. So Andrea, you have been monitoring the developments here to the degree that in these rooms you can actually hear what people say, because the sound is atrocious. And there is my friend Mbaye, who I have to say has never betrayed me, and it always shows up like he's a faithful friend and a good friend, and I appreciate Mbaye. I know, like, you know, I have to run to a meeting, as you do have to run to meetings as well. But let's go to Andrea, and then we'll head off to Mbaye and then down the line. So Andrea, first your observations and the role the AIDA AIDA is playing a more active role nowadays in market creation.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Andre. It's a pleasure to be on the panel, even if I was called in at the very last minute, as I said. So I'll share my thoughts and the point of view of AITA on this negotiation and what it means for the market at large, outside of SABSTA, outside of the CMA, in the real world. The agreement last year in Glasgow was welcomed with enthusiasm by the private sector. The private sector had been waiting for an agreement on Article 6 for several years. So the fact that finally, after many years of trying, we had a success was, of course, welcome. But also the content of the decisions at Glasgow was largely seen as positive, as laying the foundation for a set of mechanisms that could work, could function, could attract investment in mitigation, and they will do that with a high degree of environmental integrity. The implementation of corresponding adjustment on all transfer was a big victory for those who pushed for higher environmental integrity, and these are decisions made last year that are not negotiable. In the follow-up negotiation, we have seen some of the strong divergence between parties re-emerging, and I think now we're at a point where perhaps where we have been for large parts of the negotiation, where parties have some fundamental disagreements on the design of these market mechanisms, the 6.2 cooperative frameworks and the 6.4 mechanisms. I think we need to draw a distinction between 6.2 and 6.4. In 6.4, yes, there are important decisions to be made on reporting, on review, on the technical infrastructure that will govern the architecture of the markets, but largely countries have what they need to go ahead and implement market mechanism if they wish to do that. And we have some examples. We have Japan and Switzerland that are actively seeking to buy ITMOs. We have some potential buyers that are developing policy frameworks that allow them to generate and sell ITMOs. So we see progress on that. On 6.4, situation is a bit different because it's a centralized mechanism with no decisions, no key decisions here in the Substa and in the 6.4 supervisory body that met last week. We will not have, without progress in these bodies, we will not have an operational mechanism. And that has, of course, negative implications for the market. There are projects that are looking for this mechanism to generate credits. There are projects that were under the CDM and they looking to transition. Yes, there are alternatives, the voluntary markets, other national crediting standards in some cases, but 6.4 is seen as a mechanism that can deliver value by having a central crediting infrastructure run at the UN level. So the wish is that these agreements will somehow be sorted out the same way as it happened in Glasgow. After 2 weeks of intense negotiation, finally we had a text that generated consensus by the parties. So as an introduction, I'll leave it at that, and perhaps we look into the state of VCM later in the discussion.
Thank you. And Bias, again, thanks a lot for coming. Martin, as always promised, and hopefully he will emerge at some point, but for the moment it is an empty seat there. And thanks for coming. You've been active both in the supervisory body, but also in the negotiation as the lead negotiator for the African group of negotiators, which it's been a very active group. What is your takeaway in terms of the development? Where are we heading towards? And there's also certain provisions in there that will have a relationship to voluntary markets.
Thank you, Andre, and good afternoon, and sorry for being late, but I was in some discussions. As said by Andre, I'm the lead coordinator for the African group when it comes to carbon market, Article 6, as well as KP mechanism. We just need to know, in relation to the voluntary carbon market, that from a developing country perspective, we are in a complex, different situation than we were before the Paris Agreement. before the Paris Agreement, for developing country, we have no commitment when it comes to mitigation. It's just voluntary, but we have no commitment. But now, under the Paris Agreement, each country has an NDC. And in that NDC, there is a mitigation component. And that party has the obligation to report on what's going on all mitigation activities within the country, whether they are conducted by private sector, NGO, local governments, and transacted by the VCM or whatever. The party has that obligation, since that have submitted an NDC, to report on the mitigation action achieved within the country. So even without market transaction, the party, each country needs to know what's going on in its country. While in the past, the country have no action, no effect on what's going on with the voluntary carbon market. An NGO, the private sector, can develop a project, have reduction emissions, and sell them in the voluntary market without information from the government's perspective. Now it's not possible. Even if it is not an authorization, we need to know what's going on, because we need to report on what mitigation action have been conducted in the country, in the spirit of the Paris Agreement. In addition to that, we have seen that all the projects and programs that are included in our NDC are implemented by the private sector, NGO, local governments. It's not the government who will realize the bigger part of the mitigation outcomes. Other entities will do so. We have seen also that in the commitment made by the government, sometimes there are some policies that will include, that policies will lead to mitigation activities. Those policies are implemented by the government, but the implication will be in the project from the private sector or other. And the government need to report on the impact of the policies they have put on place in terms of emission reductions. And lastly, every internationally transferred mitigation outcome, meaning emission reductions, for the use by another party's NDC, meaning if we sell units to another company abroad, but that company used those units to meet a regulation in its country, that will fall under those countries' NDC, because it's a regulation, or used by the international aviation under CORSIA, because CORSIA clearly said if you do so, you need to apply a corresponding adjustment, meaning the country itself need to do more efforts to meet its NDC. Bearing in mind all of that, the many countries, developing countries, are putting on place the infrastructure to regulate all of that. And when we set up the rules for the carbon market, what is clear is that any emission reduction used for another party's NDC, meaning for regulation or whatever, or used for other international purposes like the CORSIA, where there is will be subject to corresponding adjustment. Because it's subject to corresponding adjustment, it's subject to authorization by the host country. That is a restriction that is here, and that even if the units came from the voluntary market or coming from the 6.4 or a bilateral agreement, those units will be subject to a corresponding adjustment, and that transaction need to be authorized by the host country. Meaning now, for some of their action if the voluntary carbon market wants to play a role in 6.2, meaning transacting units for a use for another party's NDC or use for the CORSIA, the voluntary carbon market will need an authorization from the host country. And the host country will need to apply a corresponding adjustment. Also, but the voluntary market have another window to sell units without authorization. That will be just for philanthropy, for cancellation. It's not for compliance for any scheme. It's just for cancellation. If a company wants, taking into account its corporative social responsibility to cancel units, to buy units and cancel them, the voluntary carbon market doesn't need to have an authorization. There is no corresponding adjustment, and that action can be done directly. But if that those units will be used for compliance, that need an authorization, and that will be subject to corresponding adjustment. And lastly, many companies also pledging for net zero don't want their units they have acquired for their program, they don't want their units being used by someone else, neither the host country. They want those units to be exclusively dedicated for that objective net zero. So for that, we will need also to apply corresponding adjustment, and we will need also from the host country to give the authorization. That are some ideas, and some situation we'll face. The voluntary carbon market will be in a situation, if they wanted to participate in 6.2, will need to follow some rules. If wanted to continue to go for philanthropy or whatever, they can continue without an authorization, without following the Article 6. But in any case, from the host country's perspective, we are looking for having a very robust infrastructure addressing all types of carbon market, whether they are compliance or voluntary, to know what's going on, whether we provide authorization or not, and how to report on what's going on within the country. Thank you.
As I said, I was saying to Yasmin, and it gets very passionate about this topic, but the one thing that you have to understand is that you're in a very different world that we used to be 10 years ago or so, but more than 10 years ago. If you look at what is now the voluntary carbon standard, where's the voluntary carbon standard come? The voluntary carbon standard comes from, and if you'll allow me a few minutes, because I think it's an interesting story, is there was an article by Fiona Harvey in The Guardian many years ago, 2008, I can't remember, and in which she got very confused and took the voluntary, the CDM market and the voluntary market up and put everything in the same pot, and they say it was all garbage. And the reality was there was a relatively free-for-all in the voluntary market because there were no standards. So at that time, the climate group and AIDA, I was the CEO of AIDA at that time, got together and brought an ad hoc initial board to create what is now the voluntary carbon standard as a common standard, because there was no common standard, there was just a plethora of standards. We are now many, many moons away from that, because now there is increasingly Article 6.4 playing the role of, if you want, becoming a standard, and Article 6.2 providing some of this standardization that deals with corresponding adjustment and how it got recognized and so on. So if you want, the convergence of voluntary and regulatory markets has taken place in quite a substantial way over the last number of years. But let me now go to Tanya Kumar. Tanya, do you have a microphone? or you're going to get a microphone somehow. Tanya, please.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be here today. From our perspective,
I
bring...
think you have to get that microphone closer to you, unfortunately. Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Perfect. Lovely to be here with all of you today. From my perspective, I'm bringing the private sector perspective, representing businesses across Europe, and just picking up on some of the comments already made. Of course, yes, Glasgow was particularly significant for what it achieved on Article 6, but also because it was a huge culmination of the private sector and businesses getting more involved with understanding negotiations alongside setting of net zero targets, as colleagues have just alluded here. But the one critical thing that is absolutely front of mind is the transparency, the regulation, the information that is needed on voluntary carbon markets and carbon markets itself. There is absolute agreement across businesses that mitigation comes first as part of this, solution. But for some sectors, obviously, VCMs are going to be really important. But these both have to be happening in dual track. You can't have one spearheaded before the other. But that's going to need, as we're discussing here, the quality of those projects is going to be absolutely critical. And that is why the negotiations happening throughout these 2 weeks are going to be looked at very carefully. Because, of course, if you are either setting a net zero target or secondary, you're doing it philanthropically, you now want to know that what you're doing is actually additive as well. And that's going to be the most difficult problem here, to ensure that there is no double counting that occurs. So I think looking at the priorities coming out of both 6.2 and 6.4 is going to be that clarity from the standards, from governments as well, to ensure that that doesn't happen. But also companies have a huge role to be playing, looking at what's coming out of the negotiations as well, and challenging that practically as well, so that it does ladder up to the ambitions that we are setting at an NDC level. So the question now is, with those standards and regulation, how do we get to that transparency as well? Who is going to uphold that? Yes, not all of it is going to be sort of government's responsibilities, but it's got to be workable. And as that is being processed, not taking the time, like excessive time, if something is to fall down. Otherwise, the risk is some of these projects being embedded in net zero targets that do not meet the requirements that they have set out to achieve. So continuing the conversations, obviously businesses are going to be looking at this quite carefully to see the role that they're going to be playing as part of this. But the other big significant part is the interplay this is going to have on more wider sort of carbon pricing, especially as we look across Europe and the setting of carbon border adjustment mechanisms between countries. That's very much front of mind for us, and only sort of accelerated when we're looking at the impact of the global energy crisis as well. That linkage point and how VCMs also play through to those carbon markets are going to be particularly significant. But again, so that businesses can participate and the private sector can be involved in those discussions, we've got to make sure that that transparency is there. I'll leave that for now, but look forward to the Q&A session as well.
Thank you, Tanya. Yasmin, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to be here with you all and to have the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do at Advocates for International Development, and more importantly, why lawyers are essential to be involved within the dialogue. Now, going from 0 to 100 is really no easier than it is to go from 0 to 100. Whether you're lowering the ceiling or raising the baseline, as a transition as big as countering climate change, it will require dedicated action from all sectors, and we've heard all our speakers so far talk about the importance of the various stakeholders. When the Asian tsunami hit in 2004, widespread chaos and destruction followed as thousands of people lost nearly everything. But what followed shortly after? Coordinated efforts and networks of support arose in response. It was a crisis that actually led to the birth of Advocates for International Development, or A4ID as we're known, and the global pro bono outreach that we as a network now provide at zero cost to hundreds of organizations around the globe. With unparalleled expertise from the world's leading law firms and companies, A4ID tackles some of the world's most pressing issues by increasing free access to legal services and legal advice. And of course, this looks and includes the most pertinent issue for the today, and that is also for the future, and that's climate change and thereby Article 6. Indeed, as we all know, today we stand on the brink of a global climate crisis, and the crisis that ripples across rivers and oceans and wanders across mountains and valleys and has repeatedly escalated from 0 to 100, rooting itself in everyday conversation. But one that remains a crisis very much in need of even greater coordination, even greater networks of support, and even louder discourse to bring about sustainable change. At COP26, good progress was made on Article 6, but there is still a way to go, and some still very important issues to resolve. The carbon credit sector remains a relatively new and forming market. It contends with issues of quality and transparency. It is riddled with conflicts of interest as a whole host of different stakeholders join the mix, including governments, private sector companies, local communities, NGOs, and foreign investors. It facilitates cross-border agreements between the global north and the global south, treading a very fine line between creating strategic partnerships based on mutual benefit and unwittingly reinforcing global inequalities. And it is now, rightly so, witnessing new regulations at international and national levels, new questions on how to best accurately measure carbon credits, and the introduction also of a new supervisory body to help manage these. But even so, new rules will be unable to account for every eventuality in order to provide a clear roadmap for negotiating the entire spectrum of different carbon-saving products, as between so many different configurations of stakeholder. For most who need to implement the carbon-saving projects, which include developing country governments, local communities, and NGOs, the landscape is messy. But the legal community are well trained in deciphering the messy. Just last year, at COP26, A4ID published a legal guide on climate justice, which is Sustainable Development Goal 13. 1 year later, a rather sizable update is about to be published to account for the myriad changes that have already taken place, evidencing just how quickly the landscape itself is changing. The update for anyone who's interested in seeing this can be found on our website, and no doubt we'll see many more iterations in the coming years. Well practiced then in navigating the complex web of new rules, regulations, policies and laws, it is lawyers who are expertly trained to engage with the novel interjurisdictional issues that are bound to arise during the negotiation, investment and implementation stages of the new carbon credit projects. They're also best placed as experts to dictate, to uphold fairness and justice in safeguarding that these agreements and processes are made as transparently as possible and with equitable outcomes in mind. The role of law and regulation will be key if we are to create an international market of high integrity carbon credit that investors can trust. If we are to maintain a market built on benefit sharing, and if in doing so, we are to truly really seeking to reduce carbon demand for greenhouse gases and not simply displace this elsewhere. It follows then that the rule of law and lawyers and legal professionals will also be key in helping to interpret, untangle and manage this marketplace. Through networks, therefore, like A4ID, legal pro bono can be helpful, be it by consolidating new regulatory regimes, promoting best practices, and ensuring equitable outcomes or shaping ethical agreements. As Roger Lees, the chair of A4ID, and my esteemed colleague is about to demonstrate, lawyers and the legal profession can and already are playing their part to support the vision of Article 6 and the realization of inalienable responsibilities to transition from 100 to net zero. Over to you, Roger.
Okay, so should I just carry on from there? Yes, I think I will, because there's a conversation going on. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here. I'm glad to say that having heard the current state of the Article 6 negotiations, I haven't had to rewrite what I was going to say about Article 6. So, phew for that. So, over the last couple of years, I've been working with a range of stakeholders in relation to carbon credits, including standard setters, project proponents, developing country governments and others. And my opening remarks today are based upon those experiences. Also, Clifford Chance, the law firm I'm a partner at, has been working in this area for a long time. So I would want to say straight away that I'm very much drawing upon the great experience and, in fact, better expertise than I have in some of these issues that my colleagues have shared with me. My starting point here is that the voluntary carbon market ecosystem that's already developed is a valuable part of the overall solution. And it's important that progress on developing the UN-led market-based carbon trading mechanism under Article 6.4 of Paris doesn't undermine that voluntary market. The bad news is that, in fact, it already has. The good news is there's no reason why it should. I'm going to outline two main issues that I think have affected the voluntary market. But first I'll take a minute to outline the way the voluntary system is currently working and in that context discuss the two challenges and how they might be addressed. My focus here is on nature-based carbon sequestration. This is often deforestation, also reforestation, but it can also be peat bog restoration, mangrove restoration, and an increasing number of other nature-based ways of capturing carbon. The voluntary carbon market obviously also includes greenhouse gas avoidance and reduction programs, and I think my observations apply generally to those too. Generalizing somewhat, what's great about these projects is that they involve collaboration and cooperation across stakeholders. For instance, an NGO might work with a local community to design a project, ideally with involvement of local government. The private sector looking for offsets creates the ultimate demand, and there may be other actors, private and public, that may act as funders and intermediaries. So what are the two issues? The first is that there's confusion around whether Article 6 means that the issuance of carbon credits in the voluntary market in respect of a project based in a host country has a negative impact on that host country's NDC or nationally determined contribution. And we actually heard that being discussed by my colleagues over here. I think this confusion, well, I know this confusion has unfortunately led some states, such as Papua New Guinea, India, Honduras and Indonesia, to put a moratorium on, or in fact ban projects aimed at generating credits for the voluntary market because of these fears. And this means that these projects, which could benefit local communities and sequester carbon, are stalling. The issue here is that one of the principles of Article 6, as we've heard, is that sequestered carbon mustn't be double counted. In other words, must not be counted in the NDC of more than one country. So if, as Article 6 envisages, the host country sells an amount of carbon sequestered in its country to a buying country, and the buying country is going to count that carbon within its NDC, the host country must make a corresponding adjustment to its NDC so as to avoid double counting. So far, so good. The confusion comes because Article 6.4 it also encompasses transactions with non-states. And so the concern has arisen that even where a carbon credit is sold to a business, there must be a corresponding adjustment by the host state. Now, this obviously makes no sense if the business, because the business isn't a state and so doesn't have an NDC, and unless, in fact, if we write a roundabout way, it's going to be included with an NDC. I mean, I think there's a comment that could happen, and I would agree with that. Then there's no reason why those credits bought on the voluntary markets by companies pursuing their own voluntary carbon offset programs ought to involve a corresponding adjustment in that situation. And I was very happy to hear agreement on that point over to my right. Now, there's certainly some complexity and uncertainty here, but post the Glasgow decisions, I think we are clear that this common sense view I've outlined is consistent with the Article 6 mechanism. A host country doesn't have to make corresponding adjustments in relation to voluntary carbon market projects unless it registers the project under the Article 6.4 mechanism and authorises the use of the Article 6.4 credits towards the achievement of another state's NDC or another internationally recognised mitigation outcome. The second issue is that domestic law of the host state is obviously important to the success of projects, and because this is a new field, there are a range of domestic law issues that are still being worked out. In particular, who owns the so-called carbon rights, how they can be sold, and of course taxed. The solution to these domestic law issues certainly do require to be worked through, and in some countries this might even need changes in law. But I do think that life has been made more difficult than it needs to be because questions about how domestic law applies have been mixed up with the issue of who gets the cash. And this has sometimes led to the introduction of needless complexity into the debates around so-called carbon rights. And I think things become a lot easier to work through by just reducing what's happening in a project to its simplest, which is that a party, say a community controlling some land, carries out activities which captures carbon, and they get paid for doing that. Now, I'm very much simplifying here, but the important thing is that the value is created by those who control the land, and they get to sell that value. There's not some sort of separate and distinct equivalent to oils or minerals involved here. In fact, quite the opposite. The payment is to keep the carbon in the land, not to transfer it to the buyer of the credit. So the crucial domestic law issue is in fact who owns the land and who's able to carry out the activities which capture the carbon. This can be complicated, but it won't usually be a novel question for the domestic law of the state. And my final point here is that it can be separated from the question of who gets the cash, because at the end of the day, the projects generate cash, and so the state can, if it wishes, just think about whether it wants to take a share of revenues, and if so, how. And here we're on familiar ground again, looking at licensing, tax and regulation. And I would just add here, I very much recognise the point that was made earlier, that obviously a state needs to have sufficient regulation around all of this to know what's going on from the point of view of considering its own NDC and its own progress. So I'll end with some optimism that the VCM can coexist with Article 6, and indeed both together represent the best way to secure the maximum range of sources of finance for carbon sequestration projects, the benefits of which, social as well as mitigation, have already been demonstrated. Thanks. Back to you.
Thanks, Roger. Look, we've got a bit of a sunset because Mbaya is going to have to scoot out at some point, and again, I'd like to open it to the audience to start with, but if you have any question for actually the guy who is sitting behind the one of the microphones, the more vocal microphones in the negotiation, it's a time. I mean, we can all pontificate, and I negotiate Article 6 as well, but I think he is chairing the African group, and I'm a chair, so I'm not going to respond to any questions. Okay. I'll go first to you, please, and then second to you, and then third, and then fourth. So let's take the yeah. If you want to introduce yourself very quickly, but let's try and make it short, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Catalina from Center for Climate and Energy Solutions in Washington, D.C. I had a question on authorization and the use of a credit that will be bought by a company for voluntary purposes. So there is the term OIMP. Now, if the company wants to use that for a domestic compliance scheme, would that still be OIMP, or would it be a use toward an NDC? Because usually the compliance schemes end up responding to an NDC goal and target. So I'm a little confused about that transition. Or does it have to be straight away the use defined for NDC purposes?
Thank you. Let's take the next question, the gentleman here.
Yeah, thank you, Graham Maguire from Climate Neutral Group, South Africa. My question is more of a point of clarity because I'm I was getting some conflicting messaging here. From what I was understanding from what you were saying, basically, if a company in country A trades a voluntary emission into a net zero commitment in country B, country A will need to have, they'll need to authorize the corresponding adjustment. In a situation like South Africa, for example, where we have a ridiculously low carbon price, which dictates the price of the carbon offset, essentially what that would do is that the state could then refuse to provide the authorization on the corresponding adjustment in order to be able to continue to allow the carbon pricing in South Africa to remain ridiculously low. So it would create a very perverse pricing incentive, and that would be very worrying.
Well, and then there was a third, the gentleman there, and then you, yes.
Thank you. Carsten Warnecke from New Climate Institute, and it's also a question to Mbaye. Maybe I got it wrong, but I understood you, and I thank you very much for the really great explanation of the situation with Article 6.2, 6.4, authorization, corresponding adjustment. It was really very well explained. But I understood you in a way that if corporate uses units against a net zero commitment or a self-set net zero target, then corresponding adjustments are required. And I think we now heard from the other panelists complete opposite explanation, and I think you fully disagree, and I think that needs to be explained, or I got it completely wrong.
I don't think we did. I think what was common between us...
Roger,
Oh, sorry.
if I may, I think there was a last question here.
Hi, my name is Caroline van Tilburg from Climate Asset Management, and actually have one simple question. What will happen if a country has no intention to bring a project or an activity under its NDC? So it remains outside the NDC.
Very well. I think what we'll do is go ahead, and then I think Rogers wants to have a clarification, but let's go first to Mbaye.
Yeah. If a company buy emission reduction for compliance with a regulation in its country, it's considered as a transfer for another country's NDC. No, first I respond to this one, and I come to your question. Now, when it comes to a company buying an emission reduction for its net zero, there is no need of authorization, no corresponding adjustment. But the company may want those units to be correspondingly adjusted. They can request saying, in my net zero, I don't want to buy units that that are already used. Because if you don't have the corresponding adjustment, that means the host country used at the same time those units in its NDC, because it's accounted in its inventory. You buy it for your net zero, your image, your advertising, but at the same time, the host country use it to meet its NDC. It's why some company may request units to be correspondingly adjusted to ensure that if they say I am net zero, the units I use to be net zero are not used by anyone else. But it's not an obligation. You can not have a corresponding adjustment, you can have none. It's not an obligation, okay? I think it's the same in the last question in relation to net zero. Outside, we had a lot of difficulties without outside and inside. And at the end of the day, what is in the text is whether the units are inside or outside, they will be subject to corresponding adjustment. If they are sold for compliance, for another country's NDC. Some are against, but the rules we agreed on is whether they are inside or outside, there will be a corresponding adjustment. Thank you.
And I'm against, but that's okay. But I lost that. But I lost the battle. Okay, Roger, you wanted to clarify
I
something.
apologise to the chair for jumping in there, but I did, because in fact I just did want to say that I don't think there was that much of a disagreement. Hopefully, actually, my colleague explained it again pretty well there. What we're definitely agreed on is that there is no need for a host state to register and authorise carbon credits within Article 6.4. And if that doesn't happen, those are on the voluntary market and there's no corresponding adjustment needed. So so we both agree that's absolutely fine. Actually, there's this really interesting question that was raised there as well, which is, won't some companies at least be interested in buying credits that have been registered through 6.4 and authorised under 6.4, and we both agree that if it's registered and authorised under 6.4, then there does have to be a corresponding adjustment. And the reason for that, as said, is that a company, the market may develop, we don't know yet, because as we heard, 6.4 is quite a long way coming, most likely, which is another reason we need the voluntary carbon market. But basically, we could see something of if you like, a different market develop in terms of, if you like, non-6.4ers having one price and a higher price being attracted to those that have gone through 6.4, and there's a corresponding adjustment, if you like, seen as better quality and involving additionality, better assurance of additionality, etc., etc. So that's certainly, I think, one way that the market could go. So I hope that helps to clarify that we're not that far apart. There are some issues around, so don't get me wrong, but I think on that basic split anyway, I think it's relatively clear.
Yeah, and what you will be seeing probably, nothing is certain except death and taxes, but what you're probably seeing is a movement to people being under scrutiny, whether they are using authorized and with corresponding adjustment or without, and that's the next test of purity or gold standard or whatever you want to call it. But this is an evolving world. It's not a world that is static. It's something that we are discovering as we go along, what's the demand, what prices it will demand, what are people getting away with. It's not a science. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Some last issue is that based on the rules we have under 6.4 in relation to baseline and additionality, it may happen that the voluntary standard updates their rules to make more stringent the baseline and additionality issue. Because at the end of the day, we think the rules under 6.4 are more stringent to ensure the quality of the units, and in the long run, the voluntary carbon will follow. That's my personal point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I hope after the clarification there's no longer perception of disagreement. I think that the rules agreed in Glasgow are quite clear. There are things that are required, things that are not required, but within this framework, there's some optionality. And I see the pressure from civil societies, from NGOs, may turn into potentially regulation for companies with net zero targets. And this is prompting the market to focus on credits with corresponding adjustments. It's not a requirement, but it's something that the market is seeking, and I see a lot of interest in that because they very hard to get. Countries have not frameworks in place to authorize credits and apply corresponding adjustments, and in some cases there's some resistance because, as Mbai said, now all countries have their own NDCs, their own long-term decarbonization targets, and whatever they do in regard to authorization of corresponding adjustment has implication on their own trajectories. So that's something that will need to be considered, and perhaps my perspective on corresponding adjustment is that corresponding adjustment in the voluntary market is that if we try to limit the use of credits without corresponding adjustment, we will be in a situation where there's not enough credits, investments is not able to be channeled to mitigation activities because countries are not willing to authorize. So, well, I think it's a moving space, a lot of moving parts, and eventually the objective is to channel capital to especially north to south into mitigation activity, and that should be the priority, rather than perhaps getting too bogged down on specific accounting issues. Considering, I believe the framework agreed in Glasgow makes sure that there's no double counting between countries, which is what really matters.
What you have to remember is that in order to authorize, which implies a corresponding adjustment, countries have to have a framework in place. They got to know what they're doing, basically, and they got to find some senior enough civil servant in the country of X that's going to sign up on an export license, an authorization. Well, you know, I mean, this is like, you know, somebody's going to come down and ask them 5 years from now, why did you sign up on this? You know, and why did you sign up on this? So people are kind of reluctant right now to do this. The systems are not in place. It may take some time. The question, how much time, you know, in order to understand what you're selling, you're basically selling something that the private sector guy that sells that gets more money, the country gets a liability. Now, the country is not very happy to get the liability unless it gets some money with the liability. So there's got to be systems in place, royalties or something in place that collects some money to make it up that what you export. So it's an interesting but not necessarily simple process. And what Andrea is referring to is we got to get this thing going. I mean, do you want to be very pure for a beginning, or do you want to get a system going? Go ahead, please, Diagne.
No, just to agree with colleagues, the danger is of this two-tier approach being created, but obviously this need from the market and encouragement to create sort of VCMs. So the issue then when you've got these net zero targets that are coming, and I think more broadly on companies as well, they are very aptly aware of also the greenwashing that's associated with these VCMs. So that's why the frameworks and the standards are becoming increasingly important. So you're seeing the market, the private sector driving this. So that's the pull factor of the demand coming through. But the importance of what's going on in the negotiations is the frameworks, as you rightly said, because the high quality, the high integrity has to be created. Otherwise, you're going to get different quality of offsets, global offsets of the VCMs globally as well. And different companies accessing those different tiers. So that's the critical point, but the danger here is obviously the market going slightly ahead without that framework in place.
Let me take another round of questions and comments from, I think you want to come back. Elena, if you want to give the gentleman the mic back. Let's try and keep it short. If there are others in the room, just raise your hand so I can recognize you.
Thank you for giving me again the opportunity to speak, and thank you for the explanation. I think net zero targets from companies, they are currently happening in an unregulated environment. And it's not the mandate of the negotiations here to define rules for these net zero, self-declared net zero claims that companies make. And the same thing is with the voluntary car market. The voluntary car market is in an unregulated environment, especially if we talk about unauthorized credits. And there we have a meeting of two unregulated systems in a completely unregulated environment outside of the negotiations. So, but what we need is regulation also in that area, and that's happening. I think we have seen the high-level expert group recommendations. We have seen this morning the ISO net zero standard guidelines. These are all very important and encouraging documents, and there are many, many reasons why you shouldn't use unauthorized credits to claim yourself net zero. This will have huge reputational risks. These companies are doing it to avoid regulation. To tell regulators, don't look at us, we take care of the problem ourselves. It gives the wrong signal to investors, to stakeholders, to consumers. They think they really do not harm the climate, while they are not offsetting or netting out their emissions. They are just helping other countries to reduce their emissions, which is great, but it's not enough to say I've netted out my emissions, and that's what these companies are currently doing. We have earlier this year, in February, launched for the first time the climate corporate responsibility monitor. We have looked into the net zero claims of 25 of the largest worldwide companies. And these results are really shocking. These claims are of absolutely low quality. And the fact that the voluntary car market offers this huge amount of very low quality credits is one of the factors why all these CEOs have decided to come up with such a claim, even without having a plan how to reach it. This is not a question, this was a comment.
Yeah, I figured that one. And there's a gentleman here.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Louis. I work for Climeworks, a carbon dioxide removal operator. And it's a practical question to the mechanism of Article 6. So my understanding and my reading of the Glasgow decision was that a certain share of credits goes to the administration, overall mitigation of global emissions, and so forth and so on. Now, coming back to what has been discussed here, we want one system that is of high integrity. Our understanding is that the higher the integrity, also the higher the price. And Climeworks is selling at roughly $1,000 per ton at the moment. When I tell my colleagues that we should go through Article 6 route, and I tell them, hey, we're going to add another 7% or more on these thousands, I get views that tell me, hey, no, we cannot do this. Have these implications been discussed in the negotiations now?
Sorry. I'd like Mbaye and then Andrea and I think Roger and then any of you want to comment.
Thank you for your comments. And now when it comes to this overall mitigation in global emission, we have on Article 6.4, we deduct 2% in each issuance of credits for any project, 2% for the global atmosphere. So you'll get only 98%. We also deduct 5% for the overall for the share of proceeds for the adaptation. So at the end of the day, you'll get from a 6.4 project, a project registered under the 6.4 mechanism, you'll get 93% of the credits generated by the project. That's the principle under Article 6.4. Under the other schemes, voluntary market, bilateral agreement, it's not a mandatory. You can transact without having those deductions in your project at issuance. But it's a voluntary. We have said party and participating entities are strongly encouraged to apply these overall mitigation in global emission as well as OEM share of proceed for adaptation based on what is done in 6.4. That's the text. They are encouraged to do so, but there is no obligation. But we think in the long run, if the 6.4 do well and get credibility and get support with the global and the civil society and all of that, that will lead to be a reference and many others will follow. But it's just my analyze based on what I've seen in the past from the CDM and the other voluntary carbon market. But it's not an obligation for any other standard or bilateral agreement to have this deduction in the issuance. Only 6.4 has a mandatory to do it. Thank you.
I wanted to react to Carsten's comments. I agree with some of it, not all. I agree we need more regulation. We certainly need higher ambition. But that's a means to an end. What we need is emissions reductions, is investment, especially north to south, and the voluntary carbon market as it functions right now without corresponding adjustment is delivering that, and we have seen growth. The risk by mandating corresponding adjustment or discouraging companies from using the voluntary market, the risk is that these investment flows are reduced. So I think we need to be a bit careful. Then on quality, quality is very important. It has to keep improving. It has been improving. The trend has to continue. But that, in my view, does not really depend on whether the credit has a corresponding adjustment or not. It depends on the underpinning fundamental of the project. So, yeah, it might not be the main thing to focus on, or at least not the only one. And I think we risk confusing some stakeholders that is not as deep into carbon market as ourselves by focusing on certain aspects rather than others.
I think that it's incredibly important that civil society does look to hold businesses to account in relation to net zero. And I think that work, just like with other areas such as business human rights and so forth, is incredibly important. So the work your organisation is doing is very welcome. However, as you could probably gather, I disagreed with your characterisation of the current market. There's clearly it's evolving, and just as my colleague said on the right, there have been significant improvements in quality. There are standards. You know, in order for most businesses buy credits that have been verified through Vera or the gold standard or Plan Vivo. Now, if you have criticisms for them, that's obviously fine and it's part of the dialogue. But to say that there's some regulatory magic bullet out there that will make the difference, I think is just pie in the sky. I think we've got what we've got with that, and we need to work to improve those standards. Another one that I work with is Plan Vivo, a small organisation. It has the standards which also include additionality around community and around biodiversity. And what they're driven by is using these sorts of projects to drive development, working with communities in the developing world. Without the voluntary market, those projects and those communities will not get the benefits of that. That's what we need. We need the funding into it. Just one other example, and then I'll shut up. But I've been responsible for our net zero policy within Clifford Chance. If I, in pushing that, was told we got a whole load of regulation to go through before I could start looking at how we became net zero, I'd be told we're not spending the money on it. Quite frankly, I have been able to do that, and we have gone through the SBTI process. And again, you obviously have a lot of insight, and it's good to see challenges, and I really welcome that. But the SBTI is certainly a standard that businesses are looking to abide by, and obviously it's expanding rapidly. I'm sure it will come under challenge, which is obviously right. But again, those are standards that are being set. And then the final comment I would make, of course, is that if companies do get it wrong and there is greenwashing, there's plenty of people willing to litigate that out there, as we all know. And we don't live in a world without the rule of law here. And companies have been held to account all the time. There is a danger, if you look at KLM, that it has now ceased its carbon credit scheme. That means whatever projects that it was funding through that will no longer get the money. And that's something we've also got to think about in this system that we're developing.
Just to develop on that, it is a great challenge, right? Because it's the first time that we're now reporting as a business community, year on year. So that's going to uncover some bits of information that we didn't know, but it's the important part of the transparency bit. So we know where we're starting from. You're seeing sort of different sectors as well, what their comparisons are. As has been alluded to, you've obviously got SBTI, but the other big significant movement is things like the ISSB that was created last year at Glasgow. You've got the TCFD being developed for the finance community, TNFD as well. The biggest danger is obviously that all of these are working off different metrics and you're getting different figures coming out dependent on various different standards. But a big significant change is the financial community have really come on board if you're looking at the last year. So you're going to get this split of financial services and then the real world economy. Now we need to get both of those working together. What we've seen across Europe is, obviously now with the COP cycle, it's a significant moment to be tracking progress. So given obviously the theme of COP27 being implementation, that is now going to be the test for these companies. The other aspect is obviously the civil society has woken up to actually the action that's being taken. Now that's a big step change. Now that the private sector is, being held to account on various different levels, alongside obviously governments as well with their NDCs. Governments before also hadn't really engaged with the private sector, seeing them as such a large contributor to emissions. So that's a big step change. And that accountability is only going to be driven increasingly now year on year. You're obviously seeing within a lot of, shareholder updates, meetings, your annual, AGM, etc., that requirement of reporting. The other bit is obviously upskilling your boards, etc., within organizations, right? You've seen globally this new role, level of management, targets being set within management as well. So there is a big shift and change, and obviously you're working within that framework of regulation and legislation as well. It needs to be all driving to the right end goal, ultimately. And obviously different countries have set different NDCs, different sort of interim targets. The fruit is going to bear very shortly in how some of these nations are going to be actually achieving those. And the next question that corporates will be asking is, okay, well, we've done our part. What about you on the other bits? So I think that bit, it's a great challenge to have. And now we're getting into the first and second year of, okay, those companies that have set those targets, what does it actually mean in practice to set the bar for other sectors and, more globally for new companies as well? Let's not forget that we've got a lot of businesses now just starting up as well that is also giving that challenge to show what the art of the possible is. So you've got those that are nimble and then those that are slightly larger, different strategies, but still the game is all to play for.
Thank you. Andre's had to leave to go to a meeting, so I want to close up. But before we do that, is there anyone else who has any burning questions? Or any comments that you wish to share? There's some, yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to also make a comment on your position as well, because I do hear your concern, and obviously there's been a lot of concerns around greenwashing. There's been a lot of concern about greenwashing over particularly the last year, and various different financial entities coming out and sort of coming up against ESG reporting in the way that it's been going on. And I really, I think that this unification between GRI and ISSB is really important. So sort of getting that global language in place. But I also think sort of conflating the offset function, which is as part of a net zero proposition, maximally allowed to be 10%, even if every single offset removal credit, by the way, that could be used under a net zero target was doubly accounted for, that would make up a total of 5% of the net zero company's total footprint. You know, so I think we've got bigger fish to fry.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no further questions or comments, I'm then going to go back to each of our speakers. I'm going to ask them one question. So can I start with you? Can you, well, all of you, the same question. What are your last thoughts in terms of what do you expect to be achieved, or what do you hope to be achieved by COP27?
Tough question. Well, it's a bit of a crystal ball glazing question, at least the first part. what I hope for this COP or for the phase immediately after is a rapid operationalization of the 6.4 mechanism. I think it's important to provide an avenue for country to easily credit activity and access the potential of international markets. Broadly speaking, just a closing comment. I think at events like this, we discuss a lot and we get into a high level of detail, level of complexity. But outside this room, the rest of the world is very, very confused. We have governments in potential host countries that don't really understand the intricacies. Potential project developers that have good projects that don't know how to use carbon markets. So I think we should continue because these things are complicated, they require complicated discussions, but should also, I believe, we should outreach to the rest of the world and make things a bit simpler for them.
Thank you very much. Can I go to you, Roger?
Thanks, Yasmin. I would say probably the best thing that I'd like to see is sort of almost a step aside from Article 6 to come back to it, which is, you know, getting more funding to and transfers into developing country governments, both on mitigation and adaptation, and actually then, you know, quite a lot of that money being able to be used for developing countries really to be able to, you know, to skill up and to be able to deal with so many of these issues. Article 6.4 is probably only very much part of it, but it is part of it, and certainly my experience of working, you know, with developing country governments, and actually Andre sort of alluded to it as well. You know, many of these things are not going to work if there's not the capacity there in the developing country government to, you know, if they want to regulate, if they want to work out how to make schemes work in their country, how they're going to make it work, etc. You know, these are not straightforward. I said before, the local law and the local environment is certainly an issue, not at all unsolvable, but it does require capacity, which sort of requires funding and money to allow developing countries to do a lot of that. So that would be my hope.
And you, Tanya. Thank you.
I think sort of similar progress on Article 6, pretty critical, but I think also the transparency element that needs to come out of this COP is critical for us to feel like it's gained momentum. And then secondly, the important bit of implementation as well. We need to be talking, moving from the high level of what's happening in the negotiations to the real world economy, and how is that going to translate? So, you know, our responsibility across Business Europe is taking those messages back at a state level and figuring out who are the various actors and stakeholders to drive action. Because looking ahead, the next year is, you know, incredibly critical to show progress on NDCs. And we've seen year after year, most recently, we've been hit with one crisis over you know, the next. And the next year we'll face something sort of similar, and yet we are not sort of accelerating action. So the accountability element is critical for the business community coming out of this COP.
Thank you. My last thought with you would be just all of you here, every one of you, be amazing, make it happen, make it all worthwhile. That's why we're spending the days here and all the money that we're spending to come here and to get this work done. So last thing I want to say is a very big thank you to our negotiator and also to our colleagues from the, first of all, Business Europe, ERCST, and of course Advocates for International Development, our own organisation. A very big thank you to all of you for coming to join us here today and to listen so well and respectably. Thank you.